evening. This is the I-24 News Evening Edition. I'm Lucy Arish, and these are the headlines. Parallel roads in the Syrian conflict as a Syrian army roads over Aleppo continue. A Syrian opposition leader meets Russia's foreign minister in search for a breakthrough to end the war. The balance of military might shifting away from the West. This is according to a new report on global defense budgets. And culture and politics clash in Israel after a music award is granted to a controversial extreme right-wing singer. Welcome back again. As diplomatic efforts continue, the battle in Syria intensifies after a long day of airstrikes in the city of Aleppo. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was unofficially quoted admitting to congressmen that he doesn't believe that his administration approach to Syria is still working. I-24 News reporter Uli Shapiro has more.
With no major advance coming out of the Geneva II talks on Syria, international efforts are now concentrated largely behind the scenes. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a meeting today with Syrian National Coalition leader Ahmad Jarba.
We urge our European and American partners, the countries in the region, to choose the same approach. We are convinced they should work with all sides in the Syrian conflict without exception. I mean, of course, political sides, and not terrorist groups.
The Russian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs said today that Syria will complete its last transfer of chemical weapons by March this year. Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan and Turkish Foreign Minister Davutoglu also seems to be working behind the scenes as they both arrived to Berlin yesterday.
Regarding Syria, we already met in Montreux. From now on, we will cooperate even more closely, also in connection with our reference to the international community about the humanitarian situation in Syria.
Despite all these efforts, different sounds come from Washington. Secretary of State John Kerry was quoted in private off-the-record talks with 15 U.S. congressmen saying he lost faith in his own administration. Meanwhile, in Syria, business as usual. Dozens of people have died in the last few days under heavy shelling in the city of Aleppo. The Al-Qaeda forces in Syria announced today their disengagement from the jihadist group ISIS that has recently increased its activity in Iraq and Syria. With so many factions and conflict within the rebels, the diplomatic efforts have a long way to go.
And joining me right now in the studio is senior Middle East analyst Ali Waqid and Colonel Richard Camp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to the studio. So let's start with you, Ali. We see that the head of the opposition, Syrian opposition, is in Russia. It seems that Russia is playing a big role right now in the Syrian conflict.
That's what we were saying recently, Lucy. This visit means that the Syrian opposition recognized the very important role that Russia is playing. Ahmad Jarba and the Syrian coalition was betting all along on the Americans and the Western allies. And after the Geneva talks, they understood that if they want to, that any breakthrough happen in these negotiations, which will take place once again on the February 10th, they need to have an open channel with the Russian, and it is I think they had to do this step before they are negotiating now with the Russians, while the Russian experts are still contributing to the military effort of the regime on the ground. On the ground, the Syrians are having a growing advantage over the opposition, and I think that what we are seeing is that the Russians are replacing the Americans in the central role that they are playing in the Geneva talks. The opposition understand that it needs to have the Russian closer to their position before the negotiations of the 10th, where nothing was achieved because the opposition was focusing on the transition government, while the the regime was talking about end of terror attacks.
But in a way, can we say that the Russians are a little bit biased?
I would say that this is an understanding that Russia has a major role. This is an understanding that nothing can change on the ground in Syria without a Russian comprehension with the opposition. I think that in the background we have the Saudis that are sending offers to the Russians, offers that are a mixing of money and a strategic role for Russia in the Middle East. We are seeing what we were talking in the last month regarding Iran and Syria. The Russians are back big time in the Middle East.
We're seeing some leaks from the United States administration, from United States officials, that the United States is not delivering. Actually, the United States made a mistake about what is happening right now in Syria and what concerning Bashar Assad. Colonel Richard Camp, maybe it was a mistake?
I think both. I'm obviously from Britain. I think both Britain and America have made a lot of mistakes, as has Europe as a whole, in relation to Syria. And I think they've just found themselves not sure which way to turn in a situation that's been very confusing and almost intractable. And on the one hand, they initially started by giving at least moral support, and to some extent, I think, quite a lot of practical support to some of the Syrian rebels, and were then accused, of course, of supporting Al Qaeda, their arch enemies. So I think there's now a recognition, a realization that the Syrian rebels are not necessarily the way to go, but they need to get rid of Assad somehow, but not necessarily through the route they originally started out on.
Yes, Ali Waked, thank you very much for your analysis about the Syrian subject. You'll continue to stay with us for our next subject. The United States may still have the world's biggest defense budget, but according to a new report, the East is gaining around. I-24 News correspondent Charles Biblazer reports on the subject.
Since the end of World War II, the balance of power has for the most part resided in the West. But according to an annual defense budget review by IHS Janes, it may be shifting eastward. By 2015, the military spending of Russia and China together will surpass that of the entire European Union. Beijing's defense budget is expected to soar to $160 billion within 2 years, exceeding the combined expenditures of Britain, France, and Germany. Moscow's military spending is projected to increase by 44% to nearly $100 billion by 2017. But the buildup is not confined to the Far East. 4 out of the 5 fastest-growing defense budgets in the world belong to countries located in the volatile Middle East. Leading the way is Sunni Saudi Arabia, which against the backdrop of Shiite Iran's growing regional clout, has tripled its military spending over the past decade to an estimated $67 billion per year. For its part, Israel ranked 19th overall in defense spending in 2013, with a budget of more than $13 billion. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, we have lived in a unipolar world, dominated by one military superpower, the United States. But this center of gravity is warping, as Western nations, mired in financial turmoil, continue to cut their defense budgets. By 2021, military expenditures by non-NATO countries will have overtaken those of NATO nations for the first time. On Monday, NATO Secretary General issued a stark warning that the West risks ceding influence if the trend continues. One thing is clear: the East is preparing to fill any eventual power vacuum.
And still with me on set is now Richard Camp, Colonel Richard Camp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Thank you for staying with us. So this report shows basically that the East is taking over the West.
Well, I think what we're seeing is a number of things, but in particular we're seeing a reflection of the shift in economic expansion, whereby the West is having to make huge retrenchments in all areas of its spending as a result of the economic situation. But the East, with its, certainly in recent years, economic growth, is able to expand its defence spending in line with that. And I think that's probably the main driver, although in certain areas, such as the Middle East, there are other obvious drivers as well.
So we are living in, let's say, multiple era in contrast of the time of the Cold War. So why is defense budget so significant?
Well, I think we just have to look at this particular region of the world where we're sat now, the Middle East, and we look at the chaos and the death and destruction that's going on in so many countries and has been going on in so many countries to understand why defence spending is so important. We're no longer looking at present, although who knows what the future is going to hold, we're no longer looking at a clash between massed armoured forces on northern Europe, as we had thought of before. We're now looking at smaller, more isolated and more unpredictable conflicts.
But you know, sometimes we're seeing that the actual battle is not on the field, but maybe cyber battle, more like internet, more like it's happening between countries, but over the internet, over the cyber world. So why do you need more budget for that than on ground?
Well, I think it's an addition. It's not a replacement. It's an addition. Armed conflict on the ground, I think, is still as great a risk as it ever has been, and still very, very significant risk. But then on top of that, you've got the whole new layer of cyber warfare, and that is not as, I don't think it's as costly in kind of hardware terms as physical fighting, but it's certainly not cheap, and it certainly does require quite a bit of defence spending. And if you look here in the Middle East, again, it's another example why we see 4 out of 5 of the top budget increases last year and this year and planned being here in the Middle East. You know, obviously, partly it's to do with economic expansion, partly it's to do with the chaos that exists here. It's partly to do with, you know, countries like Saudi obviously are well aware of what's happened here. They want to not only be ready to defend their country from outside, but they also want to be ready to defend it from within if that kind of repetition of some of the things we've seen in the Middle East occurs there.
So if we want to look at it, how do you fight a guerrilla force like Al-Qaeda?
Well, I would say that absolutely the key element of it is intelligence. Because, of course, they operate from within a civilian community. They operate in a way it's very difficult to detect. And they're very clever as well. Many of them are very clever in concealing their activities. So intelligence is critical, and that can be extremely expensive in monitoring communications, in attempting to infiltrate their organizations with informants. All very costly, very time-consuming and critical. But then on top of that, you then have to have a means of dealing with it. And I think one of the things we've seen as being particularly significant in recent years is the increasing use of drone strikes. And of course, you know, drones have been used extensively in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and indeed out here in the Middle East.
Obama.
Well, particularly by the United States, and very effectively as well. I mean, drone strikes have sent Al-Qaeda in Pakistan reeling into a defensive war where they're no longer able to really operate as they wish to. They're having to dance to the tune of the US with its incessant drone strikes.
Colonel Richard Camp, always a pleasure to have you in the studio. Thank you very much. Israeli criticism of the U.S. Secretary of State's peace efforts continued today for the 3rd day in a row. This time, Washington isn't staying silent, and the White House National Security Advisor came to Kerry's defense. Here's I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Tal Shalev with the latest in Jerusalem and Washington.
It all started out with one word.
There's talk of boycotts.
Kerry might have meant to make a case for peace, but for the past 72 hours, the U.S. Secretary of State has been the subject of an unprecedented personal attack from Israeli officials. He's been called anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic, and even been the subject of a right-wing NGO parody.
John Kelly?
Yes.
I'm Nikki Joe Kelly.
John Kerry Solutions. Huh?
Yes.
Kerry's persistence in pursuing an Israeli-Palestinian framework agreement has already earned him the titles messianic and obsessive, but it seems the latest round of accusations has crossed the line, at least from the Obama administration point of view. Last night, the president's national security advisor, Susan Rice, came to Kerry's defense on Twitter. Rice lashed out at Israeli leaders, praising Kerry's efforts and record of support to Israel. She was joined by the secretary's spokeswoman, Jen Psaki, who too stressed that Kerry was frustrated by the harsh Israeli response.
There is no greater advocate or opponent, I should say, to boycotts or proponent of Israel's security. He always expects anyone, even those who are against the efforts underway, moving towards a peace process, not to distort his words or his record.
Netanyahu, for his part, who had first rejected Kerry's remarks, has been trying to ease the tension and has urged his fellow party members to halt the personal Kerry campaign. His spokesperson tweeted too, to make sure that Washington got the message. But the right-wing Jewish Home Party doesn't seem interested in backing down.
When you hear the U.S. Secretary of State and all this talk about the world threatening to boycott and isolate us if we don't give up Judea and Samaria, it's clear that my job is to embolden the public to support our leaders and stand strong.
With the Israeli right on his back, Kerry can at least be comforted by one voice in Israel, which traditionally tends to come to diplomatic rescue.
We thank the Secretary for his efforts, strengthen his hand, and are hoping for positive results.
Kerry is marking a year in office these days, in which he dedicated enormous amounts of time to the Israeli-Palestinian process. Though it's evident that his efforts are not appreciated by many in the Israeli government, Kerry doesn't intend to give up on the two-state solution, at least not yet. The moment when Netanyahu needs to decide between him and the right is getting closer by the day.
To something else, a French court today began a trial on Rwanda's genocide of 20 years ago. The 54-year-old former army captain Pascal Simbi Kanwanga is charged with complicity in genocide and in crimes against humanity. He is the first Rwandan to be tried over the 1994 genocide that killed some 800,000 people in just 100 days. Simbi Kawanga was an intelligence officer under Rwanda's Hutu government and was arrested on the French island of Mayotte in 2008. And joining me right now in the studio is Dr. Suki Friedman of the Paris Academic Center Law School. Thank you very much for coming.
Good evening.
So it took so long for the international community to put someone on trial for killing 800,000 people?
Actually, it took very long for France to do it, but not for the international community. We should remember that already in 1994, the international community established the ICTR, which is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and they tried over there plenty of charges, many from the government of Rwanda that would in charge for being responsible for this genocide back in 1994. But it took very long for France to do it because some say that some French government of that time had some responsibility for training the Rwandan army and supplying some weapons along the years.
So this is why it's happening in France and in Paris and not in The Hague?
Actually, there are few other countries already charged and tried Rwandan responsible people or participants to the genocide. It took France 20 years to bring someone over to justice because they have the law in place since 1996, but there was no political will to do it over there. So international community was acting through the years, again, people in charge for the genocide, but the French government took her time, and quite a long time, and some people say that just now trying to actually compensate the long years it took them to do it.
So we believe that for killing of 800,000 people, the verdict will be life sentence, but...
It looks like if he'll be charged, it will take some 8 weeks or so, and if he'll be charged, he'll face a life sentence. But since long time passed, since 20 years, and people that was witness to his involvement in so-called as a responsible, not involved, as to a certain case of killing about 1,800 people in a village in Rwanda, you know, people not already remember everything. No one actually can directly connect him by certain facts, and so it's not clear that he'll be in charge. But if he'll be charged, he'll definitely face a life sentence.
Yes, you know, today we have Nazi hunters. Maybe there will be more hunters after people that killed 800,000
it's about
people.
time.
Yes. Thank you very much,
Thank you very
Dr.
much.
Friedman, for this. And coming up on this evening edition, culture and politics clash in Israel after a music award is granted to a controversial extreme right-wing singer. And Facebook 10 years ago, the beginning of a phenomenon and how it changed culture around the world. Me and Mark Zuckerberg will be here in 2 minutes break. Welcome back. Already the world's #1 killer, the incidence of cancer, is set to rise dramatically over the next decade. According to a new report, an estimated 13 million people will die each year from the disease by 2025. I-24 News correspondent Charles Biblizer reports.
We may be living longer, but are we healthier? Perhaps not, according to a new report published by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, a subsidiary of the World Health Organization. In 2011, cancer became the #1 cause of death worldwide. By 2025, incidences of the disease are expected to increase by 50%.
Current incidence of new cases of cancer each year worldwide is about 14 million, but just in the next 12-13 years, so by 2025, this will be over 20 million new cases per year.
Already today, 1 in 8 men and 1 in 12 women can expect to die from cancer. Within a decade, deaths from the disease will rise from 8.2 million to 11.4 million per year. The report attributed the trend to a growing and aging world population and its risky lifestyle habits. In particular, the agency took aim at big tobacco, saying that smoking was, quote, inextricably linked to an anticipated surge in lung cancer. It also cited alcohol consumption, eating processed foods, not exercising enough, and infection as major causes of the disease. Released on the eve of World Cancer Day, the report was compiled by more than 250 scientists from over 40 countries. It is the first such overview in years.
The big difference with this report compared to the previous one 6 years ago is, first of all, that we're seeing a very rapid increase in the numbers of cancers worldwide, but particularly in the low and middle income countries. So this shows us that cancer is truly a global problem.
But there is hope. The report highlights major advances in cancer prevention, as well as the understanding of the underlying biology of the disease. The challenge ahead is to translate this new knowledge into cures.
Yes, and joining me now from London is Professor Bernard Stewart, the editor of the World Cancer Report 2014 and professor in the University of New South Wales. Good evening. Thank you very much for this phone call with us.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much. So this is a very comprehensive report that, can you say, is very significant, most significant, and what are the most significant findings?
The most significant findings are that despite being at a level of 14 million cases of cancer a year annually, over the next 20 years, that number will increase for the world up to 22 million cases in a single year. This means that cancer is the major cause of death in many countries, and for those that it's not, it's almost certainly number 2. And the causes of cancer, where we have established them, will allow us to curtail or alter that prospect if we act as communities and countries to address those particular causative factors.
Professor Stewart, this is very worrying, the results of this report. Did anything in this year's findings surprise you?
The report, the increase in one sense doesn't surprise me for 2 reasons. One is that cancer is a disease that is more common as individuals and communities age, and many countries, such as Australia, and I can't speak for the whole of the United States, but in many countries the proportion of elderly people is increasing. The other consideration is that in countries like China and Russia, particularly amongst men, smoking, which is the major known cause of cancer, is in fact increasing and at a very high level. So the third factor I might mention is infectious diseases associated with cancer are, if anything, increasing in low-income and some middle-income countries. So all of those situations serve to exacerbate the present level of cancer such that it daunting levels you've described.
So, Professor Stewart, you mentioned smoking. What advice would you offer the average person in terms of reducing their risk for a variety of cancers?
Look, the advice to people in high-income countries, specifically including the United States, has been clear for decades. Indeed, the Surgeon General's report in 1964 pointed out that smoking causes cancer. What's new in recent years is that we recognise that it's not just a matter of individual choice to give up smoking, that individual choice and commitment either to give up or not take it up in the first place can be supported by government action at a number of levels, including restricting availability of cigarettes, not selling them to kids, cutting out advertising and increasing price. And it's those government actions that can complement individual choice.
Yeah, Professor Bernard, it seems that the air that we're breathing can even cause cancer. Thank you very much for this, Professor Bernard Stewart. Yes. A political dispute has shaken the Israeli music industry when a controversial right extremist singer was supposed to achieve a lifetime award. This prize was eventually downgraded, but the ideological conflict remains. A report by our I-24 News culture correspondent, Shahar Peled.
A cultural political debate has been preoccupying Israel in the past couple of days, starting with a Lifetime Music Award and reaching the long-time controversy surrounding Yigal Amir, the man who assassinated Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin.
I've compared terrorists to Yigal Amir. Terrorists kill women and children in cold blood, and after 3-4 years in prison, they're released. Why can't Yigal Amir be treated the same?
In the center of the latest saga stands controversial singer Ariel Zilber. Following an impressive 5-decade career which positioned him as one of Israel's top musicians, Zilber was granted a Lifetime Achievement Award from ACUM, the Association of Composers, Authors and Publishers of Music in Israel. But over the years, after transforming from secular to extremely religious, Zilber has also made much criticized statements in support of Rabbi Meir Kahane, a radical right-wing activist whose political party was banned from parliament, as well as blunt remarks against the gay community.
I never apologized, and I won't apologize. I didn't speak against homosexuals. I spoke against the gay parades. What can I do? This bothers me.
This hasn't stopped people from loving his music, and the Lifetime Award has sparked very different views. Achinoam Nini, a world-renowned singer, decided to turn down an award from ACUM because of the dispute.
I wanted to announce that I've cancelled my participation in the ACUM Awards ceremony for ideological reasons. I request no one will accept the award on my behalf. In short, delete.
Eventually, ACUM, whose board of directors includes Dalia Rabin, the daughter of the slain former prime minister, decided to downgrade the original prize to an award for contribution to Israeli music, to which the 70-year-old singer answered outrageously in his acceptance speech.
I would give back the prize, but I cannot ignore the love that I have received from the public in recent days. If it were up to me, I would dismantle ACUM and form a new organization that champions the belief that everyone on this planet may express an opinion.
The story also trickled to the political sphere, when Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman and Economy Minister Naftali Bennett howled against the organization's resolution.
ACUM's decision goes against every cultural and creative value, and I suggest to take it back.
It's difficult to deny Ariel Zilber's musical legacy in Israel. However, for many, music isn't just music, but also the minds and agendas standing behind it. And in Ukraine, protesters continue to defend their positions behind the barricades in central Kiev as the country's parliament convened for a new term. Ahead of a parliament session, a top lawmaker said earlier today that President Viktor Yanukovych could call early elections if he is unable to strike a deal. Ukraine's opposition MPs have been calling for constitutional changes that would give parliament greater control over the formation of a government. They are pushing for laws to reduce the power of the president. The embattled Yanukovych slammed the protesters against his rule as extremism. It's official. Microsoft's CEO search is over. The software giant is appointing Satya Nadella as its new CEO to replace Steve Ballmer. 46-year-old Nadella will take over immediately, allowing Ballmer to retire early. The aiming of the CEO announcement is important as it places him in charge ahead of the closure of Microsoft Nokia deal and its ongoing reorganization. Company founder Bill Gates is also leaving the chairman role for a new role as technology advisor.
Mazel tov. The most influential and one of the most successful website of all time celebrates a decade to its first launch. I-24 News reporter Uli Shapiro looks at the key moments of Facebook and his founder, Mark Zuckerberg.
It's hard to imagine our life without it, and even harder to admit that it's only 10 years old. Today, Facebook, the most influential social website of all, celebrates a decade since its first launch. The young Mark Zuckerberg only wanted to kill some time during his long nights at Harvard University. The social network was somewhat familiar at that time, but Zuckerberg made it accessible and visually appealing, using photos and personal notes that help to define every individual member in his own personal page.
Well, I think that the primary change is that Facebook started out as a nightclub. It started out as a gathering place for kids. Let's all find each other when we're not in a physical space together. We can still connect and socialize.
Only 6 years after its birth, Facebook became a worldwide sensation that no one could ignore. Zuckerberg himself transformed from an entrepreneur to a rock star, a 2010 Time Magazine Person of the Year, and the subject of books and movies. But the greatest revolution was only yet to come. Perhaps it's too easy to link Facebook and other social networks to the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, and other upsprings that appeared over the last few years. But Facebook was the platform for those who wanted to share ideas, gather, and make a change in their countries.
We believe you can find the truth on Facebook and other social networks, not in the traditional media, which is neutral. Now we can all be both journalists and objective observers.
In 2012, the company held its initial public offering in Nasdaq, and the stock set a new record of 460 million shares trade in the first day. But over time, Facebook has disappointed its investors. Today, with 1.23 billion users, it's hard to avoid the phenomenon that's called Facebook. Nevertheless, Facebook has also suffered from millions who have abandoned it, blaming the social network for, among other things, a loss of privacy and even in acts of surveillance.
I spend more time than I would like to. And yeah, you end up, sometimes you mindlessly follow certain things and you're like, why, this is not interesting. I should be reading a book.
Does Facebook connect us or separate us from the world? How will it affect the lives of the millions who grew up under its influence? And with so many friends, why are we still alone? Many of these questions may remain unanswered, but one thing is sure. Like it or not, Facebook is here to stay.
So many friends, why are we still alone? But I am not alone, and for our weekly look at culture today, let's stay with Facebook and stay with Shachal Peren. Hello.
Hi, Lucy.
See, I love not being alone with you. And today we're staying with Facebook.
Yes, a phenomenon that definitely changed our lives, but also changed the culture that we live in and how we look at culture and entertainment. So if we take a look back to 2010, the same year actually that the Social Network, the film about the creation of Facebook, was released. Back then, the famous Hollywood talent agent Ari Emanuel made a revolutionary statement. He said that about media and the future of media. What he said is that he can see a time in which movies will be released on Facebook and not in theaters, looking at a very, very futuristic world. We're 4 years later, this hasn't happened yet, but Hollywood is definitely increasingly looking into deals with Facebook because they know it's the TV network of the future, of the digital era, and a hugely valuable distribution and advertising engine that they know Hollywood content can use.
Yeah, we've seen Netflix, for example.
Yes, and if we take, for example, Disney, we can look at Disney Facebook fan page, for example. Over 46 million people like Facebook and are fans on the Disney Facebook page. So the entertainment world knows what to do with these numbers, and this is a commercial an amazing commercial potential. So there's a lot to
so
go from
basically,
there.
when you have 36 million likes on Facebook, 36 million people are going to watch your movie.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So this is something that...
Official?
Facebook has been talking about this. Let's say Mark Zuckerberg, from the day he started Facebook, he has been talking about his company as a next generation media company. And it's no accident that 2 out of the 6 board members of his company are media executives. You mentioned Netflix. So Netflix founder is one of the board members and also the Washington Post chairman. So they know what they're doing, and they know that we look at Facebook today for our news feed, but not only for news updates, but for the entertainment recommendation columns, which was once restricted to only TV and movie critics. Now the buzz is everywhere, and I can go on Facebook and see what is recommended to watch and what to read and which performance to go to and who else will be there. So this is a great new way for us to look at entertainment and get our culture from.
Is Facebook doing something active to become?
Facebook has launched already a movie rental application with big entertainment companies like Warner Brothers and Lionsgate and Paramount. And starting 2013, they already gave users a way to add movies, books, TV shows, and more to their timeline. There's these lists of watched and want to watch. So I can add these from my from anyone's news feed to my personal timeline, to my friend's wall. So the web is for everyone, but I think we've noticed this, people realized this in the past 10 years when both grandma and the grandchild could share their experiences on the same platform.
Yeah, this is amazing. And
yes.
Who said that Facebook is about to die?
Well, we'll probably see it soon on Facebook TV.
So if you didn't receive them, like she said, you don't receive it on the internet, you will receive it in your face, the TV. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
for this. And make sure you do like or suggest a friendship to Shahal Peled and to I-24 News, of course. Still ahead on this I-24 News Evening Edition. The Daily Debate, 10 years after Facebook was born. How has our life changed and where are we headed? And on One with the man who tried to change Israel's military status quo. Don't go anywhere, 2 minutes break, and I'll be back.